Microsoft has been doing something on Windows for years that, if any smaller company tried it, would probably be called a scam. Microsoft built the dominant operating system on the planet, and then used that dominance to funnel hundreds of millions of users into its own browser, whether they wanted it or not. The European Union looked at that and said enough. This video is about what the EU forced Microsoft to change, why American regulators haven't done the same, what Microsoft's history on this issue looks like, and what it means for you as a user. To understand why the EU acted that way it did, you need to understand what the problem was specifically. When you install Windows 11 and try to open a PDF, a link, or a web page, the default browser is Edge. That's not unusual on its own. Every platform ships with its own default apps. Apple does it, Google does it. The difference is in what happens next, when you try to change that default. On Windows 11, changing your default browser was, for a significant period, deliberately complicated. Instead of a single toggle, Microsoft required users to go through a per-file type process, manually reassigning Edge for HTML files, HTML files, PDF files, HTTP links, HTTPS links, and so on, one by one. Other browsers like Chrome or Firefox could be set as default in their own settings with a single click, but Windows would frequently prompt users to reconsider or switch back to Edge. Beyond that, the Windows taskbar search, which millions of people use daily, was hardwired to Bing and Edge. Even if you had Chrome or Firefox set as your default browser, typing a search into the taskbar would still open results in Edge. Microsoft built a specific exception into Windows that bypassed your stated browser preference for that particular entry point. There were also persistent notification prompts. If you downloaded Chrome or Firefox, Windows would pop up messages suggesting you stick with Edge, framing it as the recommended or safer choice. These weren't neutral, informational messages. They were designed to create doubt and friction at the exact moment someone was about to move away from Microsoft's product. Taken individually, you could argue each of these is a minor UX decision, but together, they form a consistent pattern. Use the operating system's control over the user experience to make switching away from Edge harder than it needs to be, and make staying on Edge feel like the path of least resistance. This is the behavior the EU examined. The Digital Markets Act, the DMA, came into force in the EU in 2022 and began applying to designated gatekeepers in March 2024. Microsoft was designated as a gatekeeper specifically for Windows and for its business communication platform, Teams. The DMA doesn't operate like a typical antitrust lawsuit, where a regulator has to prove harm after the fact. Instead, it establishes upfront obligations for companies that control critical digital infrastructure. If you're a gatekeeper, you're presumed to have the kind of structural power that can distort markets, and you have to comply with specific rules regardless of whether a formal harm has been proven in court. For Microsoft and Windows, the DMA required several concrete changes for EU users. First, browser choice screens. When a new Windows device is set up in the EU, or when an existing user encounters the browser default process, Microsoft is now required to present a genuine choice screen, a clear, neutral list of available browsers, without pre-selecting Edge or framing it as the recommended option. Second, default settings must be straightforward to change. Microsoft had to simplify the process of setting a different default browser, making it a single, clear action rather than the per-file type maze it was before. Third, Microsoft had to address the search and browser linkage. For EU users, Microsoft was required to allow third-party browsers to handle searches initiated from the Windows taskbar, removing the hardwired Edge exception that existed for that entry point. Fourth, Microsoft had to stop using Windows-level notifications and prompts to steer users back to Edge after they'd made a different choice. The European Commission monitored compliance and opened formal proceedings to verify that Microsoft's changes were sufficient. This wasn't a one-time checkbox, it's an ongoing compliance obligation. Non-compliance with the DMA carries fines of up to 10% of global annual revenue, and for repeated violations, up to 20%. For a company of Microsoft's size, that's a number that demands serious attention. It's worth being precise here. Microsoft was not found guilty of a DMA violation and fined. Rather, it was designated as a gatekeeper and required to comply with obligations, and the Commission has been actively reviewing whether its compliance measures are adequate. That's a different posture from a court finding of liability, but it's still regulatory force with real teeth. Now, here's where the contrast gets stark. The United States has antitrust law. It has the Sherman Act, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. The DOJ famously sued Microsoft in the late 1990s over Internet Explorer and its integration into Windows, a case that resulted in a landmark ruling that Microsoft had violated antitrust law, followed by a settlement that many critics argued was too weak to be meaningful. Since that settlement expired in the early 2000s, there has been no comparable federal action specifically targeting Microsoft's browser or search default practices on Windows. The DOJ has been active on tech antitrust in recent years, but its major cases have focused on Google, specifically Google's search dominance and its advertising technology business. In 2023, the DOJ went to trial arguing that Google had illegally maintained its monopoly in general search, partly by paying billions of dollars to Apple and other device makers to be the default search engine. That case resulted in a ruling in 2024 finding Google liable for monopolization, but a finding against Google for paying to be the default search engine coexists, without contradiction, with Microsoft using its own operating system to privilege its own browser and search engine. And there's no equivalent ongoing federal case targeting Microsoft's specific conduct around Edge and Bing. The FTC has broad authority to police unfair or deceptive practices, but it hasn't pursued Microsoft's browser default tactics as a standalone enforcement action. At the state level, there have been no significant actions comparable to the EU's DMA obligations either. This isn't purely political, there are genuine legal and structural reasons why US antitrust enforcement moves differently. American antitrust law has historically required showing actual consumer harm in a fairly rigorous economic sense, not just the existence of market power. European competition law has always been more willing to impose structural obligations on dominant firms preemptively. The DMA represents an even further step in that direction. It's essentially a regulatory regime that applies because you're big and powerful, full stop. But legal complexity aside, the practical result is simple. A Windows user in Germany gets a neutral browser choice screen. A Windows user in Texas gets the same nudges and defaults that were deemed problematic enough to regulate in the EU. Same software, same company, different treatment. You might be thinking this is a browser war, and browsers are free, so why does it actually matter who uses what? Fair question. Here's the answer. Browsers are not just viewers for web pages. They are increasingly the primary computing environment for a huge portion of digital activity. Enterprise software, productivity tools, communication platforms, a growing share of these run in browsers. The browser you use determines which browser engine renders the web for you, which affects how web standards evolve, which affects what kind of web gets built. There are currently 3 major browser engines in serious use: Chromium, which powers Chrome, Edge, and dozens of other browsers, WebKit, which powers Safari, and Gecko, which powers Firefox. If one browser gains sufficiently dominant market share, web developers increasingly build for that browser's specific behaviors and quirks, which over time can make other browsers less compatible and less viable. This has already happened in a mild form. Web developers today primarily test against Chromium-based browsers because that's where the users are. Firefox's market share has declined significantly from its peak. Safari maintains its position largely because of iPhone lock-in, the healthy competition between multiple browser engines that benefits everyone who uses the internet is genuinely fragile. When an operating system with around 70% of the global desktop market uses its control over default settings and user experience to push one browser, that matters for the browser market overall. The users who never bother to change their default, and that's a substantial portion of any user population, become Edge users by inertia. That's market share built not by Edge being better, but by Microsoft owning the front door. And browser market share translates directly to Microsoft's ability to monetize Bing. Edge defaults to Bing. Every user who stays on Edge and uses the address bar or default search is a Bing search. Bing generates advertising revenue, so Microsoft's motivation here isn't abstract. It's a direct revenue funnel from Windows ownership to Bing ad revenue. After the DMA designations took effect, Microsoft made changes for EU users. It introduced browser choice screens for new device setups. It simplified the default changing process. It committed to allowing third-party browsers to handle taskbar searches. But here's where the story gets more complicated. Compliance with a regulation and genuine good faith adherence to its spirit aren't always the same thing. The European Commission has been explicit that it's actively reviewing whether Microsoft's DMA compliance measures are sufficient. There are open questions about whether the choice screens Microsoft implemented present options in a genuinely neutral way, and whether all the pathways that previously funneled users toward Edge have been addressed. This is not unique to Microsoft. Apple has faced similar scrutiny under the DMA for its browser choice implementation on iOS, with concerns that the process was still unnecessarily cumbersome. Google has faced scrutiny around its search choice screen design. Designing a genuinely neutral choice screen turns out to be surprisingly contested. The order options appear in, the visual design, whether one option looks more prominent than another, all of these can influence user behavior. The broader picture is that the DMA has set up an ongoing regulatory dialogue between the European Commission and these major gatekeepers, with the Commission pushing for changes, companies making adjustments, and regulators evaluating whether those adjustments are sufficient. It's a continuous process, not a one-time fix. Meanwhile, outside the EU, Microsoft continues to operate under the same basic structure it always has on this issue. Edge comes pre-installed, default, and reinforced by multiple points of friction against switching. The company has made some modifications globally. The per-file type default process was partially simplified in response to public criticism, but the fundamental structure of Windows as Edge funnel remains intact for users outside the EU's jurisdiction. There are a few possible paths that could change the situation for American users. One is congressional action. There have been proposals in the US Congress to create legislation similar in spirit to the DMA, requiring large platform operators to meet specific interoperability and fairness obligations. The American Innovation and Choice Online Act was one such proposal that attracted bipartisan support but did not pass into law. Similar proposals may be reintroduced, but the legislative environment for tech regulation in the US has been slow-moving. Another path is DOJ action. The DOJ's case against Google and the ongoing remedies phase of that case could result in structural changes to how defaults work across the industry. If remedies require Google to stop paying for default placement, that disrupts the economic model that currently benefits both Google and the platform owners who receive those payments, including Apple, and potentially creating pressure on Microsoft's own default practices. A third possibility is market competition. If a new platform or operating system genuinely displaced Windows desktop dominance, Microsoft's ability to leverage that position would naturally diminish. That seems unlikely in the near term given Windows' entrenched position, but the long-term shift toward mobile computing, where Microsoft has essentially no presence, is already changing where people spend their digital time. The least likely path is voluntary corporate behavior. Microsoft has shown, consistently over multiple years and multiple rounds of public criticism, that it will maintain these practices until legally required to change them. The EU required change and got change. Where there is no equivalent legal requirement, there is no equivalent change. Here's what this story actually comes down to. Microsoft built an operating system that runs on the majority of the world's desktop and laptop computers. It then used that position to quietly, persistently, systematically advantage its own browser and search engine, not through Edge being a better product, but through control over defaults, friction against switching, and access points that bypass user preferences. The EU decided that kind of behavior from a gatekeeper requires specific legal constraints and imposed them through the Digital Markets Act. Microsoft complied, at least in form, for its EU users. Those users now get a meaningfully different experience when it comes to browser choice on Windows. Everyone else continues to get the version of Windows that Microsoft designed before anyone made it legally expensive to do otherwise. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's not speculation. It's the documented behavior of a company responding rationally to legal incentives. Where there are legal consequences for this conduct, Microsoft has modified it. Where there aren't, it hasn't. The question that's worth sitting with is this: if the behavior was problematic enough that the EU felt compelled to write an entire regulatory framework to stop it, what does it say that the largest democracy in the world hasn't found a way to protect its own users in the same way? The EU didn't discover some exotic legal theory. It decided that when you control the platform, you don't get to secretly also control what runs on top of it. Until that changes, users outside Europe are on their own, and the best protection available to any of them is simply knowing that the defaults they were handed weren't chosen with their interests in mind.